Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another class, ABF, How the Story Ends. I'm not going to recap the whole thing like I did last week as a summary, but let me just say we're coming down to the wire here trying to figure out how the human story is going to be wrapped up. So many loose ends throughout the Bible. The Bible is a unified document. One of the reasons I believe the Bible is true is that it fits together so well. It was written over the course of probably 2,500 to 3,000 years, and all the authors who added pieces to it wrote it in such a way that it fits all together like a cohesive whole. And that, to me, is one of the most remarkable things, and one of the reasons why I believe that the stories the Bible tells are absolutely correct and true. So anyway, the story has been leading us to this book of Revelation where everything sort of gets resolved at the end. And the problem is if you start at the end, right, you don't know what's come before it, and you run the risk of actually misunderstanding what's going on because you don't know what has brought us to this point. Well, we've worked through all of that, and we've come to the book of Revelation, and we're in the midst of God bringing judgments upon fallen, unrepentant, rebellious humanity. And last week we talked about chapter 15, where we have the final 7 judgments from God. And when these final 7 judgments are done, God's wrath is going to kind of put a bow on it, tie it off, it's all done. However, it's going to be a pretty horrific show of his wrath on display right here at the very, very end of this 7-year period of trouble called the time of tribulation, or the 70th week of the book of Daniel. And we talked about the fact that last week we talked about the fact in chapter 15 that God's wrath is going to be on display, but this is a good thing. This is like actually something to worship God for, because God is only doing what is right. God is not just reacting out of rage and anger. He's not just mindlessly seeking revenge or vindictiveness, any of that. He is justly trying to give people what they have earned through their horrifyingly evil actions. And so if the punishment is bad, it's because the offense was bad. And so that's what the attention is being drawn to. And along the way, there's a warning to humanity. Hey, this is coming, and it's going to be bad for you if you are on the wrong side of this. So here's how to respond. I want you to fear me. I want you to worship me. I want you to glorify my name. That's the purpose. That's what God wants from humanity at this point. And what we find out instead, as we go down through chapter 16, is that when the judgment comes, instead of softening towards God, humanity actually hardens. They don't fear God. They do the opposite and continue to act any way that they want without taking God seriously. Instead of worshiping God, they become stiffly independent and say, I'm going to do this my way, and I'm not going to back down, and I'm not going to change my ways. I'm not going to go backwards. And then, of course, they don't glorify God's name. They curse God's name. They drag God's name through the mud. They don't acknowledge that he was right, I was wrong. They just merrily go forward, and they say, well, this is just the way it's going to be, and I'm going to play this out all the way to the final move. Unfortunately for humanity, that final move is going to end with a checkmate. And maybe it would have been better if they'd have just tipped over the king early and surrendered to this God instead of seeing how it all plays out in the end. Because that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at chapter 16. And in chapter 16, these 7 angels who have these 7 bowls full of liquefied form of the wrath of God, they are going to pour out those bowls on humanity. And basically everything that we've seen so far is not as intense as what we're about to see here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of briefly go through each one of these bowls, because they're pretty obvious as far as what they are. It doesn't seem to be a lot of nuance or really deep symbolic understandings, about what's going on. And then I'm going to come back and we're going to ask ourselves the question, where have we seen this before? Like, what does this remind us of? Is there a story in the Old Testament that sort of gives us the framework for understanding what's happening here? And why would John, if that's true, why would John use the same language here that was used back then? What is he trying to get at? What is he trying to teach us? What does he want us to understand? And then from there, we should come to an end, hopefully in the next less than an hour or so. And hope that you can stick with me all the way through. As always, if you need notes, the notes are online on our website, fbchh.org. We have Along the top, there's a tab that says Resources. You click on the Resources tab. About halfway down, you have ABF Notes, and they are the same notes from last week, but we're going to be picking up at this question. So what do these judgments consist of, bowls 1 through 6? And that's kind of a major bullet point, I think, at the beginning of the second page of those notes. So anyway, what do these judgments consist of? What actually happens here? Let's take a look at verse 1 and 2, and we'll see what happens with the first bowl. Then I heard a loud voice from the temple telling the 7 angels, "Go and pour out on the earth the 7 bowls of the wrath of God." So the loud voice from the temple presumably is either God himself, or it's one of God's angels that he has delegated with the responsibility of reminding these angels to do their job. But again, this reminds us that this is not just something that's randomly happening. It's not something that some, crazy angel decided to go rogue and grab these bowls and start throwing it on the earth. This is God deliberately administrating his justice to the earth. And so he says to these 7 angels, "Go ahead, pour out these bowls of the wrath of God." And what does the first one happen? Verse 2. So the first angel went and poured out his bowl on the earth, and harmful and painful sores came upon the people who bore the mark of the beast and worshipped its image. Okay, so bowl number 1, and this is the first blank, painful sores. But I want you to notice this is not hit everybody. This is not painful sores on humanity. This isn't like something in the air so that anybody who breathes the air gets this affliction. This is specifically targeting a group of people. And who is the group of people? Remember we talked about 2 teams last week? We talked about I'll start with this team. Team B, probably Team B for Team Beast. Get it? Sorry, I'm a dad and I'm a pastor, so I'm really in trouble with my jokes. But Team B is led by the dragon, who is Satan. But he's delegated his authority to what is called the beast. Some people call him the Antichrist, the one who takes the place of Christ. That's kind of what that Antichrist thing means. So Team B, or I'll say Team Beast, right? This is going to be the dragon, the beast, and then he's got his little flunky called the false prophet. I won't even talk about him. But then there's also his servants. And how do you know that you're a servant of the beast? Is you've taken his mark. And we don't know exactly what it is, but it seems like it's some kind of a physical mark, like something you could actually see with your eyes. And it's somehow connected to the number 666. We don't know exactly what that means. I don't think there's any biblical student or interpreter alive who really knows what that means. But either way, we have this team, Team Beast, the dragon, the beast, who's the Antichrist, and then his servants. This, by the way, is the majority of people on earth still alive, right? Because a lot of the Christians have been rounded up and killed by this point, a lot of the people who worship God. So they're mostly off the scene. I think there's a very small minority of people that are a part of what I'm calling Team Lamb over here, right? And that includes the Lamb. It includes the group that we talked about, the 144,000. And these 144,000 are witnesses, I believe, of God's who bear his message to the earth. They're Jewish people, and they've been marked as well. They've been sealed, which is a kind of a sign of protection. And then there's also the people who accept their message. So this is Team Lamb versus Team Beast. And it's very interesting. Both teams, apparently, there's still representatives from both teams still on planet Earth. But this particular plague, this particular bowl of wrath, only hits one of these 2 teams. It only hits Team Beast. And it seems like it doesn't even necessarily hit the beast, although maybe it does. It seems to be targeted at his servants. His servants who have received the mark of the beast. Right? That's what it says. Who bore the mark of the beast and who worshipped its images. So again, it's a reminder that taking the mark and worshiping the beast, those are like the same thing. You don't just take the mark for secular reasons because you want to do business, but you don't really get into this whole religion stuff. No, it's all been blended together. The worship of the beast is the same thing as taking the mark and conducting business. And so they've made that choice, basically. They've decided, I'm joining Team Beasts. And because of that, plague 1 falls on them. And the plague is sores, painful sores, it says. Harmful and painful sores. Now, we're going to come back to the painful sores a little bit later on in this series of plagues here. But have you ever, okay, this is really silly, okay? I have a paper cut on my thumb. Just a paper cut. But I've had dry skin as well, right? And I'm washing my hands all the time for COVID reasons, but also just because I live with 4 boys and you know what that means. And so I'm always constantly washing my hands. And this paper cut would not heal for the longest stinking time. I'm very grateful to report I have a little bit of a scab over it now so that every time I touch it, it doesn't hurt me. But that's not even an example of a sore. If you've ever had a boil or you've ever had something like that, something swollen, something infected, something like a lot of pressure and pain, like, right? Imagine all of a sudden those breaking out over your body. Yikes. So this is painful. This is obviously not designed to kill anybody, but it's designed to increase their pain. But then bowls number 2 and 3 are sort of connected together. They're sort of combined, and they're sort of like one lump. They're 2 separate bowls, and they affect 2 different areas, but they have the same effect. Look at verse 3. The second angel poured out his bowl into the sea. Now, the sea there, that's salt water, right? The sea would be, to people in Israel, the most common thing that they would think of. They wouldn't think of the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. They would think of the Mediterranean Sea, right? That giant saltwater body of water right there along the coastline of Israel. So again, does this mean that it's referring to like the Mediterranean Sea and all the oceans around the entire planet? Maybe it's just a reference to the Mediterranean Sea. I don't know. But either way, it hits the salt water. And when it hits the salt water, it became like the blood of a corpse. And every living thing died that was in the sea. Even if that's just the Mediterranean Sea, can you imagine? Well, first of all, how horrifying to look out across and see, use this beautiful blue water all of a sudden as a sickening red. Probably a deep, dark red. Probably an oily, slimy red. And you put your finger in it and it smells and it tastes like blood because it is blood. And there's no reason, by the way, to not take that literally. There's no reason to think that he's saying some metaphorical thing here. It's pretty clear that he's saying, no, it was water and now it's blood. Now, blood and water share some similar characteristics. They're both liquids, for example. But obviously one draws revulsion and fear from us, while the other it gives us life and joy. If you're really thirsty and you go and you see water, it enlivens your spirit. That's just the way it is. So the third angel, verse 4, poured out his bowl into the rivers and the springs of water, and they became blood. So bowl number 2, right? Here's the blank. Sea turned to blood. All sea creatures die. I want you to picture all the fish floating up to the surface, right? You didn't even have to stick a dynamite into the lake, right? To blow up and kill all the fish and have them have some fishing for you. That's my idea of fishing, right? I might actually catch something. Picture because now there's not water, there's blood. All the creatures living in the water die, probably pretty immediately because they can't breathe, the way they do with their gills. They can't breathe blood, so they float up. And so here across, as far as you can see, are the dead carcasses of living creatures that were once in the sea. They're now floating on top of the surface. I mean, you want to talk about horrifying. Can you imagine the smell? Can you imagine the stench after a few days, especially if it's still sunny and hot? What's happening there? I mean, just horrifying to imagine, right? But then it's even worse than that, because it's not just the sea out there where we look for our food. It's also fresh water. That's what bowl number 3 is, right? Fresh water turned to blood, which, if you think about the practical applications of that, so what does that actually mean for humanity, right? If the sea is turned to blood and all the sea creatures are dead, guess what? You can't fish. And people rely upon fishing, especially by coastal areas. They rely on that for their income, but also just to feed their families, right? To feed the world with that fish, with those fish. Talk about transport. I suppose you could still get a boat out and transport yourself, but what a horrifying experience that would be. So that has that effect. But what about when all of a sudden all the fresh water turns to blood as well? The rivers and streams, the springs it talks about. Of course, in the ancient world, a spring, right, is where you would have an oasis in the desert, and that's where all the animals would come and drink, and that's where all the people would come and get their wells, and because we need water to survive. And basically, God totally turns off the faucet and says, no more water for you, no more water sources for you. Instead, you're going to get blood. Now, blood, in some ways, like I said, has some similarities with water, but it is not life-giving. It would kill you. And so the effect of this is that the only thing you have left to drink is blood. That's all there is to drink. Now, I don't know, if you can capture rainwater and all that stuff, and I'm sure humanity will try to be as creative as possible because their lives will be at stake. This is another reason, by the way, that I think these judgments are happening like one right after the other really quickly, because humanity can't survive more than 2 or 3 days, right? If all the water supplies have been turned to blood in the world, like people are going to start dying of thirst because you just can't survive. So that's why I think all these things are happening like boom, 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 really quickly. Now, again, there are other sources of water, right? Maybe there's it doesn't say here that, if you've been storing water in some kind of a silo or storing water somewhere, that's all of a sudden going to turn to blood. All it's trying to point out is that the places we normally look for that life-giving liquid called water is going to be converted to blood, and it's going to be just horrifying. Now, the irony of this, or the poetic justice, right? You've heard that expression, poetic justice? The poetic justice of this is that's when the angel who's in charge of the waters speaks up with the stuff we talked about yesterday. Verse 5, you are just, O Holy One, who was and who is and who was, for you brought these judgments. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and you've given them blood to drink. It is what they deserve. The poetic justice, right, is that they've been drinking the blood, metaphorically, of God's people for centuries, for millennia. The blood of the prophets and of the saints is literally soaked into the ground all around them throughout this 7-year period as they march them in front of this image of the beast and say, which team do you want to join? If you say Team Lamb, they cut your throat and your blood drops into the ground right there. So it's like, okay, you've been living metaphorically as if you want to drink blood for your entire existence. So God's like, you know what the punishment is? You're going to have to physically drink blood. You're going to be reminded. And don't you think it wasn't a reminder? Every time they drank that blood, they were thinking of the culpability and the guilt that they bore of shedding the blood of innocent people. I think it's God's way of trying to pierce their conscience and saying, this is what you've been doing metaphorically. How can I make it more vivid for you? I know. I'll make it so that you have to literally drink blood if you want to survive. Now, again, I don't know how that's going to work. I don't know if they're going to try to purify the blood, separate the water from the blood parts, and I don't know. Right? That's beyond what the text is trying to say. But if you want to have something to drink, you're going to have to drink blood. They've been drinking the blood of the prophets for centuries, and so God's like, it's fair. That's fair. Now, bowl number 4. Bowl number 4, jump down to verse 8. The fourth angel poured out his bowl on the sun, and it was allowed to scorch people with fire. Scorch people with fire. Verse 9, they were scorched by the fierce heat, and they cursed the name of God who had power over, and what's the word they used? Plagues. Over these plagues. They did not repent and give him glory. So the fourth bowl, and this is where you fill in the blank here, the sun scorches people with heat and with fire. Now, I don't know if this means there's going to be just because the sun, by the way, already sends quite a bit of heat our way. And if it wasn't for our atmosphere that is thinner in some places than others, which is why there's some parts of the world that are hotter than others, that are closer to the sun than others, right? That are tilted away from the sun, tends to be a little bit more cold and versus what's right in the path of the sun. If for example, if there was a giant hole in our atmosphere, and all of a sudden the sun's rays just came down on us, it would scorch the world as it exists. I mean, all you got to do is go to a desert and you see the effects of that, both proximity to the sun, but also like a thinning of the atmosphere. Imagine if what this judgment means is that God takes away part of that atmosphere to protect humanity from the assaults of the sun. Or maybe it is like literal assaults from the sun, like God turns the heat up on the sun, and the sun is just shooting out more and more heat and even fire coming from the sun to land on earth. I mean, that's just awful. That's horrifying. I imagine it's going to be happening all over the earth and not just in the places you would expect near the equators. It's going to be happening all over the place because this is a supernatural judgment, right? And of course, as they're being scorched, does that get their attention, right? They touch the hot thing. Does that change their mind about fearing God and worshiping him and glorifying his name? No, the opposite. They curse the name of the God who has the power over these plagues. If he had power, why wouldn't he take these away? Why would he bring these to us? Who does he think he is, right? We're not going to fear him. We're going to fight him. They did not repent. We're not going to change our ways. We're going to stick with what we're doing, and we're going to be stubborn and resistant to the end. And we're not going to give God glory. We're going to drag his name through the mud, and we're going to put ourselves up on that pedestal, right? So in other words, it's not having the effect. God's wrath is falling, but it's not working. Verse 10, the fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and its kingdom was plunged into darkness. So what is bowl number 5? It's a supernatural darkness. This one is fascinating to me because on the one hand, you're like, okay, what's the big deal? Darkness. You know, we can, and again, I'm assuming things about the electrical grid in the future. I'm assuming that we haven't been blown back to the Stone Age and there's no electricity. I'm assuming that there's some sort of electrical power grid going on in the earth and they're powering things much like we do today. Although I could be totally wrong. Maybe civilization has taken so many steps backwards that they're back to torches and oil and stuff like that in order to light their way. Maybe they don't have access to the electrical grid like we do today. But either way, a supernatural darkness comes over the earth, and you kind of go, okay, what's the big deal about that? Well, for one thing, it's super creepy, right? And after a while, look at how the Bible describes it, because this is okay. Its kingdom was plunged into darkness. Look what people gnawed their tongues in anguish. Gnawed their tongues in anguish. And cursed the God of heaven for their pain and their sores. They did not repent of their deeds. So again, this reminds us that these bowls, at least somewhat, are happening concurrently at the same time. The boils on the flesh, the sores, are still there troubling them while this darkness is troubling them as well. So imagine going from all of a sudden the sun is scorching people with fire and heat to all of a sudden the lights are out. There is no stars. There is no sun. There is nothing you can see. Now, I don't know if this means that God puts another barrier around the earth so that we can't see out, some supernatural darkness that kind of covers the earth, the ball of the earth, like a covering. Or if God literally makes the lights go out. I mean, he has the power to do either one. It's not like either one of them is too hard for him. I think it's more likely that he's just covering up the earth and not allowing anything to be seen. But the entire kingdom, and again, who is being targeted here? The people who are being targeted are the mark of the beast, Team Beast, the people who have the sores, who are a part of his kingdom. They're the ones that are dealing with this supernatural darkness. Now, this is also appropriate, right? Because John, like a fair judgment, because John has said, if you go back to John chapter 3, verse 19, it says, here's the verdict, right? Light came into the world, and let me just read it because it's fun. I've got the time, let me use it right. John 3, verse 19 says this, this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed. In other words, John is saying, metaphorically speaking, spiritually speaking, you people hate light anyway. Darkness, this is what you say you want. You want to be able to hide everything from God. You want God not to be able to see all the things you're doing to offend him. So, okay, here you go. Here's your judgment. You get what you want. You get darkness. But you still have your sores. And you still have all these other things you're dealing with. And now you have this unending pain and the darkness. You know what the darkness will do? The darkness will eliminate distractions so that you only have a few things to think about. And what you have to think about are how much your body hurts, okay? When most of us, by the way, I don't think it's a coincidence that most of the times when we go to the emergency room or when we get sick enough that we have to call the ambulance or something like that, it happens at nighttime. Why is that? Because we're trying to rest, we're trying to sleep, we're trying to shut out all the other distractions, and all we have left to think about is how we feel, is our physical ailments or our emotional, spiritual ailments. Think about it. When was the last time you really punished yourself over a mistake you've made in the past? Usually it's probably when you're laying down to sleep trying to get some rest, and those thoughts pop into your head. Or you have a dream that reminds you of some memories that are painful, and you kind of rehearse it. And you're in the dark, you don't want to get up because you don't want to start the day. You know you're supposed to be sleeping, but you can't sleep. All you can think about is the dream you just had. Or if you're sick, all you can think about, like I wake up in the night with a sore throat. If I wake up in the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, and I have trouble going back to sleep, then the only thing I'm thinking about is that every time I swallow, I feel like there's, razor blades in the back of my throat. And it seems so much worse. During the day, I probably am having the same symptoms, but I'm busy, I'm moving, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm watching this thing, I'm looking outside, my attention's distracted. Whereas if there's supernatural darkness, all you have to think about are the things that are going wrong in your life. You can't do business like normal, right? You certainly can't do business like normal. You can't tell the time the same way as you could by sun up, sundown. All of our normal human rhythms are getting disrupted. And I wonder if God is giving people the opportunity to really think about what they've done, right? When a kid does something that's wrong and they throw a conniption fit and they're like, "Arr," and they're right in front of everybody. Sometimes what we do, when we don't want to beat them in front of the child, we send them to their room. Go to your room and think about what you've done. Now, the reason we do that is because we want to take them out of an emotional situation. We want to put them in more of a distracted thing where they don't have some of the same distractions they would normally have. And hopefully then they'll calm down, they'll think about things, and then when we come to talk to them alone in their room, they'll be a little bit more soft and a little bit more sensitive and a little bit more responsive to what we want to say to them, right? Maybe God's doing something like that. Maybe God's turning out the lights. He's eliminating the distractions. Now, this would be perfect, by the way, if the electrical grid is gone and when people don't have the access, they can't just turn on Netflix when this happens, right? If there's no power, and if you've ever lost power in your house at night, and we lived in South America where power outages were like a normal thing, and so we always kept candles all over the house because you never knew when we're going to lose power at 6, 7 o'clock at night and not get it back till like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. It just happened. To this day, my parents live in New England, so they get a lot of ice storms, so a lot of electrical wires go down, and so they'll lose power for X amount of time, and you're in the darkness and you don't have a choice, and you're just there. You got nothing to do. So if that's happening, then what else is humanity going to do but sit around and think about what they've done? Sit around and think about what's happening in the world. All these judgments that are happening, like one right after the other. First, it's the sores. Then it's the blood. Water turned to blood, and we're thirsty. So we're in physical pain. We're thirsty. We're scorched, and maybe we have burns on our bodies, and like the crops are dying, and our animals are dying, and like all this stuff is happening. Oh, and by the way, here's darkness for a while to think about this and think about what you've done. So supernatural darkness, that's bowl number 5. And then bowl number 6, and I'm not going to spend as much time on this right now. I may come back to this a little bit later when we get to chapter 19. But let me just address it, and then we'll come back to it. It says, the 6th angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates. Okay, now in the Bible, there's a few major rivers, but one of them, you've heard of the Nile River down by Egypt. There's the Jordan River that's in Israel, which is really, by the way, not that big of a river. Like the Mississippi would look at the Jordan River and kind of giggle, right? In a lot of places, the Jordan River is like Catherine Creek up by Millport where I live. It's like a little tiny meandering little path. At some points, it widens out. But most of the time, it's like this little creek that goes up and down, right? So there's a few, but the key river are the Tigris rivers and the Euphrates River, and those are in the area of Babylon. And that's the Fertile Crescent is what they call that area there, where because of the Tigris and the Euphrates, areas that would normally be desert have green, lush life, and you can have crops. And that's why people from ancient civilizations, going all the way back to ancient Sumer, in the 2000s BC, before the time of Abraham, that's why they created their civilizations right up there along the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And from there, humanity seems to have spread out, obviously, into the rest of the world and discovered other rivers. But it seems like it started out right there. And the Tigris and the Euphrates have been very important in the biblical story. That's where Babylon later on gets established, okay? A lot of times the children of Israel get taken off into captivity to Babylon, right? And there's that one psalm that says, by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion, and basically we remembered home, we were homesick. What are the rivers of Babylon? It's Tigris and the Euphrates rivers that kind of split off there. So here's the Euphrates River, the great river Euphrates, is sort of the ultimate river that they think of. And its water was dried up. So I presume that it already was turned to blood, perhaps. I mean, it's possible that the fresh waters turned to blood were specifically maybe it's in the kingdom of Israel, right? It could be just limited to that region, was turned to blood. I think it's likely that it's more worldwide. So it's possible the Euphrates River has already been turned to blood, but then immediately, it seems like instantaneously, it goes from being this giant mass of blood in where the water used to be. But now it's just dry ground. Now it's just, it evaporates and it's gone. It dries up. And all of a sudden now, it opens up an opportunity for movement to prepare the way for the kings from the east. Interesting. And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon and out of the mouth of the beast and out of the mouth of the false prophet 3 unclean spirits like frogs. For they are demonic spirits performing signs who go abroad to the kings of the whole world to assemble them for battle on the great day of God the Almighty. So this is interesting. Bowl number 6 is, yes, the river Euphrates, here's a blank, dries up. But it dries up for a specific purpose. Now, the people who live by the Euphrates River, by the way, this is a really bad deal for them because their life comes from that river. But again, they don't have a lot longer of human. We're talking days now in human history, so they're gonna have to live. They're not going to live with this for very long. But basically, as a part of this, not only does the Euphrates River dry up, but then there's these 3 demonic spirits, I think, like frogs. That'll be important in just a minute. But there's these 3 demonic spirits that resemble frogs, right? And these frogs, I know, it's so weird. But these 3 unclean spirits, one of them comes out of the mouth of the dragon. That's one of them. Another one comes out of the beast. And then also there's the false prophet. And he shoots one up there as well. And these 3 unclean spirits have a mission. And their mission is to go to all the kingdoms all around the entire earth. And their job is going to be to deceive them, to trick them, to perform signs, to convince them that they need to act immediately. And the goal is to assemble all the kings of the earth for one final battle on the great day of God the Almighty. Now, that implies to me, by the way, that the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet know what's coming. They are not ignorant about what these signs mean that God is dropping, because at the end of this period of judgment is going to be the return of Messiah to establish his kingdom. So I think the beast and the false prophet and the dragon, Satan, they understand what's at stake. And they know a battle is coming, the final battle, the battle to end all battles. Literally, sorry, Saddam Hussein, you were a little bit off there in your calculations. But the ultimate battle to end all battles was going to happen, and they needed to assemble all the armies and all the kings of the world together in order to unite, not to fight with each other. At least it doesn't seem like they're there to fight with each other, but they're going to come together all at once to unify and fight against the day of God Almighty. And the return, I believe, and I think the text is clear, the return of Messiah to establish his Father's kingdom on earth. And the drying up of the Euphrates is God's way of helping to facilitate that happening. God's way of saying, okay, all right, you want to bring everybody together? You want a royal rumble here at the very end? You want to take me on? You want to grab me by the horns and you want to see if you can handle it? Fine. See, this is the thing about a lot of God's judgments. Sometimes God judges us by giving us what we say we want, right? Only to discover that what we wanted was not at all what we should want or what we needed or in the end what was good for us. God sometimes shows his incredible wisdom by just simply giving us the things that we want that are toxic and then realizing in the end that it was foolish to want that thing. So humanity wants to unite against God, and the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers are interfering with troop movements and things like that. Let's dry them up. Come on, bring it on. It's almost like God is saying right here at the very end, okay, so it's time. I've been delaying this judgment. I've been putting it off. I've been setting it aside. I've been giving you time to repent. I've been doing all these things, trying to get your attention. Apparently, we've gone too far for that. All that's left is the battle. Bring it. Bring it. You think you're tough? You think your weapons, you think the combined armies of humanity is going to scare me? Come on, bring it on. Bring it on. And then you have verse 15. This is a really interesting verse, by the way. Oh, you know what? I'll come back to that a little bit later. I'll come back to that a little bit later. Because in my translation, it has a parentheses there, right? Because this verse is sort of like it was inserted by Jesus into the middle of the conversation. It kind of breaks up the action so that we sort of know what's coming. We'll talk about the function of that verse in just a minute. But then verse 16 shows us that worked. So they send out the 3 frogs. They convince the kings of the earth. They bring all their armies together, verse 16, and they assembled them at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon, which, by the way, I know this is kind of cool, at least for me. I've been there. In the northern part of Israel, there is a valley between mountain ranges called Har Megiddo, which means the valley of Megiddo. And Megiddo is one of the cities in and around there. And the idea there is, it's this fertile, it's called the Jordan Valley as well. This fertile plain right in the middle of Israel for miles and miles and miles, and there's mountains on either side. And it's I mean, if you're going to have a battle, especially in the ancient world, a flat space is the best place to have a battle because you can deploy your troops and no one side has an advantage over the other. And so if you're going to assemble all your armies, this is the place to do it. So they bring all of those armies from all over the place across the Fertile Crescent, across the Tigris, or what used to be the Euphrates River, it's dried up now, and they bring them all to Israel, right here, boom, right in the middle. And so you get the sense, humanity's like, okay, God, you're going to pour out your wrath upon us, you're going to judge us, you're going to destroy us, fine. We've been willing to just pretend like you don't exist, but now we're coming together and we're going to fight you. You want a battle, God? You're going to get a battle. And everybody kind of assembles and all the armies of the earth congregate there in Israel. And then, ironically, the story kind of pauses. And chapters 17 and 18 and the first part of 19, we get another one of these side steps, these little excursus, this little rabbit trail that explains a little bit more of the background about what is about to happen at this battle. But it's like, you want to talk about dramatic tension? It's probably literally going to be close to a month, maybe 3 weeks, before we dive into the next thing that actually happens in the story chronologically, which is you have this giant army waiting for a rumble with Jesus, and then Jesus splits the clouds and he shows up with his armies. Like, that's the next thing chronologically that's going to happen. But the rest of chapter 17, from when they pour out the 7th bowl, there's this giant earthquake. And then 17 and 18 talks about Babylon, and we'll get to that next week or the week after, don't worry. And then there's a little bit of rejoicing in heaven, and there's the marriage supper of the Lamb, and then we rejoin all of the armies waiting on earth to battle against God and his king, Jesus. And we come back to it, okay? So before we dive in, though, to all that stuff, I want us to ask this question. In the last few minutes that we have, I want us to kind of explore this a little bit. Here's a question, and it's in your notes right here, right? Do these judgments bear any resemblance to anything that you've heard of somewhere else? Any resemblance? As you've been listening to me describe these judgments, are there any ideas in them or any words that are being used that make you think of something else? And some of you may have already gotten there a long time ago, okay? But really what John is doing is he's using the way he's describing these judgments, he is going all the way back to, and here's what fits in your blanks, okay? And I'm going to erase this because I want to list it out on the board here. He is connecting these judgments, the bold judgments, very intentionally, I believe. He's connecting them very intentionally to the plagues. How do I put it there? To the plagues that happened at the Exodus. The plagues of the Exodus. There's so many verbal connections between this passage and the Exodus, it's ridiculous, okay? If you remember the story in the Exodus, right? God's people are slaves in Egypt. They're under the bondage of an oppressive people. They are crying out to God for relief from this horrible burden of oppression and slavery. And God sends Moses, and Moses goes with Aaron. And what does God do? He starts to ask Pharaoh to let his people go. Pharaoh is not a fool, and so Pharaoh is not convinced right away. He doesn't even know who this God is. Why would I give up my free labor that's building my palaces and my kingdoms and my treasure cities and my chariot cities? Why am I going to just let them go for free? Who does this God think that he is? And so, of course, Pharaoh's answer originally is absolutely not. In fact, I'm going to punish your people for the fact that you're even asking me the question. And so God says, okay, so if you won't let the people go, I'm going to make you let them go. So if you jump back in your Bibles almost all the way to the beginning to Exodus chapter 7. Exodus chapter 7 records Moses and Aaron's interview with Pharaoh, the first one, where they say, hey, just let our people go. And honestly, if Pharaoh had said, sure, then he would have lost his slaves, but he would have kept his country pretty much intact. And instead, he decides to basically, verse 13. So look at verse 13, right? Exodus 7:13. But still, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. Verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. So go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water. Stand on the bank of the Nile to meet him. Take in your hand the staff that turned into a serpent. And you shall say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But so far you have not obeyed. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord, or Yahweh. Behold, with the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn into what? Blood. The fish in the Nile shall die, and the Nile will stink, and the Egyptians will grow weary of drinking water from the Nile. And the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, plural, their canals and their ponds and all their pools of water, so that they may become blood, and there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, even in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. Verse 20, Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded. In the sight of Pharaoh and the sight of his servants, he lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile. All the water in the Nile turned into blood, and the fish in the Nile died, and the Nile stank, so the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. So Pharaoh turned and went into his house, and he did not take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the Nile. And 7 full days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. Crazy, right? Sounds a lot like one of the bowl judgments, actually 2 of the bowl judgments, right? So what are the connections? Let me just start listing the connections. So first of all, we have God's people oppressed. Does that bear any resemblance to the situation for Team Lamb in the tribulation? Absolutely. God's people are oppressed, probably crying out to God for justice every day and protection. So you have God's people that are oppressed. You have an evil ruler who is hardened in heart. That's also true in the book of Revelation, right? You've got the dragon and the beast. Is the beast going to back down? Is he going to say, you know what, God, I throw up my white flag? No, he's going to play this out to the very end, and his people are going to follow him. So that's already two similarities to this. But then you have the very blatant similarity of water to blood. And this is God saying, look, Pharaoh, hey, buddy, you want to know who I am? Let me show you who I am. You think your river is protected by your gods? I am the only God that exists. I will destroy your river to prove to you your gods are nothing compared to me. I am the God you should fear. I'm the God you should worship. I'm the God you should give glory to, right? So the plagues of Egypt and of the Exodus are a battle. They're a description of a war being fought between God and an oppressive nation and the gods of that oppressive nation in order to set his people free. That's what the Exodus is all about. So why is John using the same language in the book of Revelation? To remind us that this is what is also happening. It's almost like a second plagues of Exodus kind of a story. God is hitting the earth and he is sending judgment because his people are being oppressed. There's an evil ruler, the beast, who is hardened in heart and who is oppressing God's people. And so he's like, you know what? I'm going to give you a taste of what it's like to rumble with me. You want to fight me? You want to just, I will ruin you. I will end you. And I will start off, I'm going to turn water to blood. I'm going to touch all of your fresh water. You'll be dependent completely upon me. You won't be able to drink any water. You'll be thirsty. Okay? Now, notice what the second plague is. What's the second plague? If your chapter titles have, if you have little chapter titles in your Bible, mine says the second plague, which is what? Frogs. Frogs. It must have been comical. There's frogs everywhere. There are frogs hopping everywhere, and it's driving them nuts. Now, again, apparently I'm told, I haven't done a lot of research on this myself, but I'm told that frogs were one of the gods of the Egyptians took the form of a frog. And so this is God sort of mocking the idea that you worship frogs, right? And so he's like, I'll multiply, I'll give you millions of frogs. You won't be able to get rid of them, and they'll be everywhere. They're hopping everywhere, and they're contaminating everything. But do you remember from our story, these three deceiving spirits, what are they like? The text says they're like frogs. And I always thought that was really weird until I realized that John is connecting the story of the plagues of Exodus to the story of the 7 bowl judgments that God is doing. And so these creatures that go out and deceive the kings of the earth, what do they look like? They look like little frogs going out there to deceive and destroy, right? Just like the false gods of Egypt, in essence, deceived Pharaoh into thinking he should be faithful to them instead of listening to the God of the Jews. So the frogs, there's another point of connection. See, I'm going to come over to the side. I'll go this way so you can actually see what I'm writing, okay? So there's the frogs, but then there's more resemblances here. What other things? See, did I write them down? Of course I didn't. Okay, yeah. Remember the painful sores? Look down at chapter 9. Exodus 9, verses 8 through 12. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of soot from the kiln and let Moses throw them in the air in the sight of Pharaoh. It shall become fine dust all over the land of Egypt and become boils breaking out in sores on man and beast throughout all the land of Egypt. So he does and they do. And notice how the people respond. And the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils came upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had spoken to Moses. So we also have the boils, or the sores. And these sores are painful. They're so painful that the magicians can't even stand up. They've got to lay down. They don't have the energy. Maybe the boils were on their feet. Who knows? But they're in a lot of pain. So that's another connection here. But not only that, there's another connection. Look in the very next chapter, chapter 10. Verse 21 of Exodus. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness to be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was pitch darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days. But all the people of Israel had light where they lived, right? Targeting specific people. Not targeting the people of Israel, targeting the enemies of Israel. So you have the frogs, you have the sores, you also have supernatural darkness. Combined with the sores. The sores, I don't think they've gone away either. And then, of course, the most interesting connection to me at all is the connection. Remember the people who are singing in Revelation chapter 15, right? Revelation chapter 15, they're talking about God's just nature and why it's okay for him to judge the earth and punish the earth. And they said this, they sing it in song form. Do you remember who wrote that song? It's the Song of Moses, right? It's the Song of Moses. Now, we don't have in the Old Testament a record of a song that Moses wrote that was anything at all like what they say, the martyrs say here in Revelation chapter 15. So clearly this is another song written by Moses that he must have written and we just didn't record it for us, or maybe he's written it since he's been in heaven or something, I don't know. But either way, John is trying, and at least I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different ways. And by the way, the 7th bowl judgment also involves giant hail, like hundreds of pounds of heavy rock, hail, and ice that fall to the earth, which is another one of the plagues that hit Egypt. So, and at least, I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 7, 8, if you include the reference to Moses in chapter 15. 8 different ways John is connecting verbally these bowl judgments with the plagues. Even the fact that they're called plagues, that's another thing I meant to mention here. They're also called plagues. Well, these are Jewish people who are reading this. They know the stories. You say the word plague. Even those of us that have grown up in church, you hear the word plague, usually you think of the Exodus story because that was one of the ones we'd always learn in Sunday school, and it had all the really cool, flannel graph about the different plagues that came on Egypt, I mean. So God is obviously connecting all these things together. God is deliberately trying to help us to understand that these events at the end are like that. And then I think it's really fascinating because after the Exodus is over, they've crossed the Red Sea, there is a famous song also, I don't know if it's composed by Moses or if it's composed by the children of Israel, but there's this famous song at the end of the Exodus that celebrates God and honestly worships God for his judgment in a very similar way that the Song of Moses does in Revelation chapter 15. So really quick, just humor me, okay? I spend a lot of time on this stuff. You got to humor me sometimes. Go to Exodus chapter 15. Verse 1. This is the only other example in Scripture of Moses singing a song. And it's not surprising to me, at least, that the themes in this song are very similar to the themes in Revelation 15, which are connected to these bowl judgments of the wrath of God that are pictured as new plagues hitting not the kingdom of Egypt this time, but the kingdom of the beast and all those who follow him. Exodus 15:1 says this, Then Moses and the people of Israel sang this song to the Lord, saying, I will sing to the Lord. Why? For he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. That's literally true about Egypt, right? Their chariots that were drowned in the Red Sea. The Lord is my strength and my song and has become my salvation. This is my God and I will praise him. My father's God and I will exalt him. The Lord is a man of war. Some versions translated a mighty warrior. The Lord is his name. Now, what did he do? Pharaoh's chariots and his host he cast into the sea. His chosen officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrow your adversaries. You send out your fury, your wrath. It consumes them like stubble. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword. My hand shall destroy them. You blew with your wind. The sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness? Holiness. Remember from 15, Revelation? Awesome in glorious deeds. Just and true are your deeds. Doing wonders. You stretched out your right hand. The earth swallowed them. And then it talks about the reaction of all the other nations to what has happened. How God acting in this way is going to get the attention and the fealty and the fear of the nations. Look at verse 15. Or no, go ahead and look at verse 13. You've led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them by your strength to your holy abode. The peoples have heard, they tremble, right? They fear. Pangs have seized the inhabitants of Philistia. Now the chiefs of Edom are dismayed. Trembling seizes the leaders of Moab. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fall upon them. Because of the greatness of your arm, they are still as a stone, till your people, O Lord, pass by, till the people pass by whom you have purchased. You will bring them in. You will plant them on your own mountain, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. The Lord will reign forever and ever. So John wants us to understand that these judgments, these bowl judgments of the wrath of God, it's a second Exodus. It's another opportunity for God to go to war with sinful humanity, rebellious humanity, on behalf of his people that are being oppressed. And he is going to go to war. He's going to fight. He's going to bring them back. He's going to take his people through this, and he is going to, on the other side of this battle, the battle that's about to come, according to John, all the armies of the earth are assembled there to fight. On the other side of that battle, God is going to plant his people. He's going to plant the ones who are faithful to him, who are oppressed, and his kingdom is going to be on the other side. The Lord reigns forever. John wants you to go back to Exodus 15 and just chew on that as you look at Revelation. Because Revelation is the ultimate expression of God's victory over the forces of evil on the planet. And his wrath is the sign that he deserves to be worshiped, that he is God, that he is everything he claims to be. He's doing what is right and what is just, and he's going to go to war against the forces of evil, and he's going to destroy the forces of evil to protect and save his people. So ultimately, that's what these judgments are. These judgments are a way to destroy the forces of evil so that God's people can be rescued, and ultimately God's kingdom can be established in the earth, planted where he intended to plant them. And you know me, I'm kind of a geek for how the parts of the Bible connect to one another. And I love it that John, here at the very, 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 very end of the story, reaches back almost all the way to the beginning to say, what God started with Egypt, he's going to finish here. This is where God finishes the story of human history. And he finishes it by destroying all of God's enemies, rescuing God's people, and bringing them into his kingdom. A second Exodus. And a second set of plagues to go along with it. Because humanity is just as hardened and as stubborn as Pharaoh ever was. The beast and those who took his mark are stubborn and hard of heart, just like Pharaoh was. And God is going to get to a point where all he can do is judge. All he can do is destroy what is left against him, and therefore glorify his own name by having victory over those who oppose him. Now, really quick, I just want to mention something about verse 15. So back to Revelation 16, verse 15, please. Right in the middle of the story about the Armageddon and gathering all the armies together, you had this verse. It says, "Behold, I'm coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake, keeping his garments on, that he may not go about naked and be seen exposed." This is an actual quote from Jesus Christ himself. It's almost like the lamb, as John is telling the story, interrupts him and throws this in and says, hey, I want you to realize something. I'm coming like a thief. Now, verse 15, and here's your final couple blanks, and then we'll move on. Verse 15 functions as a warning on at least two different levels. That's the first blank. So this is a warning, right? First of all, it's a warning, first arrow there, for readers of all eras to remember they have a responsibility to be ready for Jesus' return whenever that may be. You know, Jesus uses this very commonly during his own lifetime. He talked about being ready. Matthew 24, 25, and 26 tell some really interesting stories that Jesus told about how it's important for people, while we're waiting for Jesus to come back, to be in a posture of preparation, to be looking for him, to not take advantage of the fact that he's not here and kind of do whatever you want and be lazy and self-absorbed. No, we're supposed to be busy serving him, fulfilling his commands, doing all that. This little verse inserted here in a strange place, it's inserted here, I think, to be like, hey, look, we're almost here at the end. I want to remind everybody from all of time, you've got to be ready for my return because you don't know when I'm coming back. I'm coming like a thief. I'm going to sneak in. It's not going to be immediately obvious when I'm coming back. So you need to be ready. You need to be ready. Now, the second part of this is for readers, again, in the tribulation itself, to realize that the end is almost here. So don't lose your focus when you're this close to the finish line, right? I've made this contention to you guys before that I think that a lot of the book of Revelation was written not for our generation, but for the generation that's going to live through these events. As they find old copies of the Bible, they can actually read from God's perspective what is happening all around them. So I think the book of Revelation is going to make way more sense to the people reading it during the time of the tribulation than it'll ever make to us, because we're not living through that time right now. So this is also a reminder from Jesus to the people reading it during the tribulation itself to say, hang in there. We're almost at the end. We're almost right at that final battle. It's almost over. This is scary and hard and painful and it's awful, but it's almost over. Don't lose your focus at the end. Don't trip 1/10 of a mile from the finish line. Stick with it. You know, the marathons, they're 26.2 miles. And that last 0.2, my wife tells me, she ran a marathon once. The last 0.2 miles is just like agony. It's like, oh, come on. I've already done 26 miles. I just want to lay down and die, right? And what Jesus is saying is, look, I'm coming. It's coming quickly. It's going to happen when you don't expect it. Be ready. Be ready. You don't want to be embarrassed. You don't want to be unprepared. You want to be ready. And I think that's our posture is always supposed to be. Knowing that he is coming back motivates us to be ready for his return that could happen from our perspective at any time. God has his plan and God knows when it's going to be. We don't know, so we need to live every day as if we're ready. And that's a perfectly good place for us to stop this week with this question. Are you ready? I'm not saying, are you ready for the tribulation and for judgment? I'm not asking that. Are you ready for the return of Jesus Christ? Are there things in your life that you're like, you know what, someday when I get serious about my spiritual life, I'll tackle that. Someday when, I get older or when I've had my fun here or when my job gets less stressful or when my kids are grown up or whatever the thing is, I'll do that later. And when Jesus is like, really? You don't know how much time you have. And you really shouldn't waste opportunities. You need to take advantage. I'm coming like a thief and you won't know when it's going to happen. And I think that's a good message for us, a good point of application. You never quite know, so you have to be ready at all times. Next week, we're going to dive into chapter 17 and 18, which is a description of Babylon and the destruction of God's enemies. And it's a little bit out there, and it's a little bit hard to piece together. And I think we're going to focus more on the general feel and tone of it versus the individual details. But chapters 17 and 18 talk about God's righteous judgments on a world system that has been opposed to him probably for all of time, and how much of a relief it is to the world when that world system that is corrupt is finally destroyed. And they're finally set free from these people that have led us astray for all our lives. So we'll talk about that next time, probably the next couple weeks. I love you guys. Hope you have a great rest of your week. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.